every week.
Patrick Moore, your timing is impeccable.
Impeccable. Impeccable.
You going to tell everybody what you did?
Well, no, because this is a well-run, perfectly well-oiled machine. Smooth here, and I did not.
Machine.
No matter what you may hear, I did not leave my notes in my office and have to dash back to my office and grab my notes. And
that was pretty good
just
time.
Arrived.
That was pretty good time.
That's
four and a half minutes all the way across campus.
That's right. I got a job.
I'm sorry. No, not bad for an old guy.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
And the show is called More and Friends, by the way.
And we actually have friends
plural
here
friends.
today.
Awesome.
We're very excited.
Absolutely.
We're very excited. More and Friends. Go ahead.
So he's Patrick Moore.
And she's Erica Edwards.
Indeed I am. And we're glad you're here. And it looks like we've got the entire history faculty at Richland College.
Well, actually, we have the history faculty that's important anyway.
Absolutely.
The important part of the history faculty.
Anyone who is anyone is here today.
Right.
Absolutely.
The history faculty is actually enormous. How many full-time history faculty are there? 7. And do you have any idea how many adjuncts there are? About 30.
Wow.
So,
okay, I can't compete with that.
So yeah, we don't have quite all 37 of them in the room here.
37 wouldn't fit.
Right. But we have the chief intellectual base of the history faculty
Excellent.
here in the room with us. That's
well, we should call upon. What was that? What was that?
Curtis is talking out of school here. Briefly, this is More and Friends. For the past 3 or 4 years, we've been doing this show. Erica and I have been doing it, calling it More and Friends. But actually, Erica was always my only friend, except for a couple of times.
We're expanding his horizons.
That's right. So, but it's been just a straight current events show, current event discussion. Let me blow off steam each week about current events. But this year, I decided that I wanted to do something different, and so I've been interviewing somebody from around campus or some bodies from around campus about their disciplines or about their function on campus, and it's been really interesting for me, and I've learned a lot, and I hope anyone who's listened has actually learned a lot too, because we've had some great Wednesday shows here. Today is the day of history. You know what? One more thing before we get started, and that is anyone who's listening in, go to Twitter and use the hashtag KDUX, hashtag KDUX, to send in any questions or comments you might have for the history faculty here at Richland. Anything you have always wanted to know but hadn't asked, or anything you've wanted to know and gotten an insufficient answer to, or anything that we say here that jars your mind to ask a question or make a comment, we'd love to hear from you. Hashtag KDUX, and please get on and let us know. We have gotten plenty of questions over the last few weeks, and we'd love to get some more.
We are carefully monitoring
Twitter, hashtag KDUX, hashtag KDUX. We haven't carefully monitored Facebook, and it may be that would be a good thing to do sometime when we advance our technology even further. But
our attention span, at any rate.
Or our attention span. Mm-hmm. So before we get started into the content here, the first thing is always to ask my guests who they are. I'd like for each of you in turn to introduce yourself and tell us who you are, where you came from, what's your training, what's your background, what's your experience, what led you to be here today at Richland teaching history. Why don't we start with you, Curtis?
Well, I'm Curtis Thomas. And
thank you.
And originally hailed from New York City, from Brooklyn, New York.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Cool.
And
why Texas?
Well, I came here because of a Christian mission organization originally.
Awesome.
Called Wycliffe Bible Translators.
I've heard of them.
Worked for a number of years. And while I was here, I got a part-time job at Mountain View, and then a temporary full-time position, and it went from there. Kind of background. You want background?
Sure, yes, absolutely. Okay. Everyone is interested.
Okay, how much time do we have here?
Not too much.
The radio version. Remember, this is broadcast.
Or the elevator speech. Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
Well, a lot of history. I went to a Christian liberal arts college in New York called Nyack College, and then from there to New York University.
NYU.
And from there to the University of Denver, and from there to the University of Texas at Arlington, and from there to University of North Texas.
I've been everywhere, man.
He kept getting booted out.
That's what it was. Right. I have no doubt.
So that's the long and the short.
Yeah, that's great. I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Who's next?
I'm Clive Siegle. I actually came into the education biz fairly late. Most of my time was spent in business. I was in the Field and Stream business as an outfitter. I was the editor of a safari magazine. I worked for ExxonMobil when it was just Mobil, as in their exploration and producing. And then I guess I was about 55. Not that I looked that old, but when I was
not.
about 55, I realized that I'd always liked teaching, and if I was ever going to do it on a professional basis, I'd best get with it. And so, so I dropped a perfectly good job with Mobil and went back to school and got a PhD at SMU in history. My master's is in international affairs. And I finished up, and I did some teaching at SMU, but this is my full-time job now.
Cool. Yeah. In fact, we started at roughly the same time.
We did indeed.
All three of us.
All three
of us.
Erica
that's
as
right.
well.
We
That's
were
right.
we were all in the same Visions of Excellence classes.
That's
certainly
exactly
were.
right.
Made friends with
VOE.
these characters.
Yep.
So that reminds me of one question. How long have you been here, Curtis?
You guys are making me feel old. So.
You are old.
I got here originally in 1989 when I
Okay.
started full time.
There are plenty of people on this campus who've been here longer than that. So
Yes, I know.
Right.
Next.
finally,
Nice segue.
last but certainly not least,
I'm John Trickel. I've been in this racket virtually the whole time. Got a BA and MA from University of Tulsa. Shortly after that, I got drafted, so I joined the service expecting to be discharged because I'm deaf in one ear. Finally was.
tilt it up a little bit toward your mouth there. We can hear you better.
It's not
Yeah.
sticking.
Erica's going to come give you a hand. We are having a hard time hearing you on the radio. Here comes the professional.
Hello. Testing
Hello?
1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
Yeah, John, if you just pick that microphone up, you could do like an open mic thing.
Can you not lift it up a little, Erica? I mean, yeah, the whole arm thing. I don't think it's gonna.
It's not
working.
Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
There.
There we
try,
go.
Try that and get
Okay.
as
Now
close
is that
Close
better?
as you can.
A little
Okay, that's
closer,
better.
A little closer.
I think that's
There you
better.
go.
Good.
Awesome.
Thank you, John.
Awesome.
Thank you,
All right.
Erica.
All right. Well, all these technical problems.
I know.
Anyway, make a long story short, got medically discharged, came back, taught 4 months of junior high school, drove me crazy.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Got an offer to teach community college in Arkansas, which I immediately did, and loved it from the minute I started. Went back, worked on a PhD at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, became ABD, came to Dallas, was offered a job at Richland in 1973, and I've been here ever since. I completed a doctorate from University of North Texas in 1980. So I've been at Richland 45 years and college teaching 47 years.
That is a few years of experience, which is outstanding.
You still here?
It's experience.
So my students always tell me that I should teach history because I've seen all of it.
Well, that's
Which is, I always say that's not a very nice thing to say. So that's
Sure.
always my reaction. Okay. Okay, let's just start out with some technical detail about your classes. By y'all I mean history faculty here at Richland, basically teach 2 classes, right?
That's correct.
History 1301, 1302.
yeah.
Tell me what those are, what they cover, and I guess since I have 3 of you, I'm just going to throw these questions out and depend on y'all to pick them up. And if I feel like one person is getting too much attention, I'll just point at somebody else. But go ahead. Why don't y'all just dive in? What do you think, John? First.
Well, 1301 is from colonial, from settlements, European settlement in the New World, to the conclusion of the Civil War and Reconstruction. I mean,
Okay.
that's the dynamics of the time period.
Okay. And then the second one is post-Reconstruction.
To as far as you can get.
1878.
Yeah, very few people get to the present, I might add,
Oh,
because
yeah?
it's a telescoping kind of thing. Every day is new history.
Right.
So, I mean, there will eventually, someday, we won't be around for it, be a third, like 1303 or
Sure,
something like that.
sure.
I mean, there pretty much has to be, because you're racing to get anywhere near the present. And I, in my own case, I realized that the present is at least something is known about it. So the student will know something, but it's the 20 and 30 years ago kind of stuff that they wouldn't. So that's where I end.
I was thinking, Clive, we call it journalism, history as it happens.
Yeah, that's right. That's it.
I call it
Journalism.
current events.
Current events, yeah.
That works too.
I've thought that the second course ought to go from the end of Reconstruction up through the end of World War II, and then pick up there.
At some universities, that's what they do.
Oh, is that right?
So, yeah.
See, I'm ahead of my time.
Yes.
Right,
even
and
know
some
that.
people actually, myself included, finished 1301 with the end of the Civil War, because it's a watershed period. And then Reconstruction, I pick up in 1302.
Okay.
But that's strictly a personal, a personal view.
And so there is flexibility among the faculty with to
Well,
exactly
we
what
take-
you
we
Don't tell the
liberty.
coordinating.
take the
board.
liberty.
That's right. That's right.
I hope you're not listening.
How much Texas history specifically do y'all cover? Is there any, because we're in Texas, do you spend any extra time at all on Texas, or just sort of ignore the fact that we're in Texas? And
He does, I don't.
Well,
Okay.
what we did as a department is we do in fact emphasize a bit more Texas history, because our textbook is a custom textbook. In fact, it's one of probably the most innovative, if I do say so myself, custom books in the business. And what we did is we realized that history does not just necessarily be national.
Right.
In order for it to really work, you have to understand what's going on around you and what had gone around, on when around you. And so what we did is the faculty here stepped up to the plate, and we developed a book. We used a regular standard base textbook, and we added they're historic vignettes, and we call them Tales of Texas is what we termed them. And they cover specific things that would have gone on in Texas when things were going on nationally. Like, for instance, the Great Depression. Okay, fine, it's the Great Depression. I mean, banks are failing, blah, blah, blah. But what actually happened here during the Great Depression? How did the New Deal affect Dallas? Well, that's about a 2.5-page vignette in there about it. Or what about Prohibition? What about those kinds of things? So in a way, we do actually address
some-
extra Texas subjects.
well, that's great, as long as John doesn't start teaching Worcester, Massachusetts history, or Curtis doesn't start teaching New York history.
Well, actually,
Can't have
I
that.
have a bias towards New York history.
Besides, it's Worcester.
Worcester.
We'll have to say it
Worcester.
correctly, right?
Worcester, right. So when you talk about from the time of the European settling, let me say it this way rather. When I'm teaching my government class, when I'm talking about the Constitution, I go back and pick up some of the Enlightenment philosophers. You can't talk about the Constitution without talking about Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. Do y'all sort of wander back into some of that sort of historical, philosophical background in covering some of your history?
Well, the history of thought, yeah. And I know in my class I cover it extensively, and some students think I'm teaching government instead of history. But
Don't step on my territory, Curtis.
they actually said that the class helps them. And
Good.
Yeah, we pitch it as
we wanna
getting
help
you a
you guys
sure
out.
A.
I appreciate it. I appreciate all the help I can get, actually. But when I was thinking about the Constitution and thinking about this question, one of the things that comes up in my class is, speaking of antecedents, as when I was being trained, when I was in school, the conventional wisdom, the prevailing wisdom, was that our history started with Europe. And the foundation of the Constitution is entirely in European Enlightenment philosophy. These days, it seems like more and more people, and this may be my imagination, so y'all tell me, you're the historians, more and more people are thinking about the contributions of indigenous people here, thinking specifically about the Iroquois Constitution. How much do y'all think? Is this something that you cover in your class or would want to comment on? And I will use your answer in my class. I'm trying to get caught up to the most recent thought. Is our Constitution really a product of European Enlightenment philosophical thought, or do we go back to more indigenous people, like, for example, the Iroquois Constitution from the Iroquois Confederation? Is that something y'all would have a comment on? Might help me out a little bit.
Well, the Constitution is a product not only of European thought, but also American experience. Every single American colony had a colonial government consisting of the three basic branches that we still have today. And so you look at their application to the European or English tradition, and then the justification is where you get the Enlightenment thought being woven in by men like Jefferson and the writers of the Constitution, some of whom, like Madison, were really very much aware of the contemporary thought that the Constitution making was gone. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea where the Iroquois Confederation Constitution would have been noted by the people who wrote our Constitution.
That's what I was taught to think. But when I read about it these days, I know that there are modern historians who are trying to go back and incorporate some of the more indigenous thinking from the indigenous people here.
Well, there is a sense in which, maybe not overtly, but you just think of the myriad place names.
Right.
And you think of, I like Nash's book, Red, Black, and White. It's an old book, but emphasizing the exchange, that we're not isolated, that Europeans just didn't bring over certain ideas, but we're also influenced by Native American culture.
Right.
And so in that sense, I think so. But, I just was teaching about the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears and how the Cherokee constructed the Constitution modeled after the U.S. Constitution. And so in that sense, probably many Native Americans tried to, how could I put it, assimilate,
Right.
Take on, I hate to put it this way, the white man's ways, and at many points not very successfully. But I see the product, that we're actually the product of that interchange. It's kind of a part of who we are as a people. And of course, Native Americans, African Americans, you name it, everybody has had input into what we are as a people.
Right.
Well, there was also some interest, certainly among the philosophes and others, about Native peoples as the ultimate democrats. They were looked upon in some cases as sort of unspoiled man. And so in that way, they influenced the thought of certain philosophers who then became the basis of that. Jefferson, for instance, although he was not at the root part of this in some ways in terms of a European specifically, was fascinated with Indians. And was always interested in them. In fact, when Lewis and Clark go out, Jefferson was very specific about this. You're to check everything out. You're to, record all this stuff. You're to do this and that. And so, in an indirect way, I think they influenced it that way,
Right.
as being models for an ideal democracy and so on. I think in that way they were.
Yeah,
I don't think many people directly looked at their constitutions, for
Right,
instance, or what
right.
passed for them.
Well, you could see the influence like in Sir Thomas More's Utopia, where Europeans had almost no information about the so-called New World, and yet they had this idealized notion. And so when he writes his book, part of his thinking was this, I wouldn't call it man in the state of innocence, I suppose.
Right.
That's the
Yeah, a lot of those philosophers talked about, specifically the state of nature, and
Yeah, right.
Hobbes' life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and
right.
that was the foundation of a lot of that thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the ideas of Indian governance did enter into to other peripheral stuff, like, for instance, treaty making, and the understanding of how power and governance worked among tribes versus the ideas of, say, those who are making the treaties. And a great deal of the problems with constructing those sorts of things, particularly in the 19th century, was the fact that there was a great deal of perceptions that were incorrect, and so treaties were often badly constructed, and they were meant to fail in the long run, simply because organically they just flat were were incomplete and were based on premises that weren't always so.
And also, having worked in cultures and clan societies and the like for many years, Europeans often impose their forms on Native Americans. So when we talk about treaty making, I remember part of my training to work in New Guinea is never trust the first person to step forward and say, I'm leader. And you recognize in a lot of clan societies that they're cooperative relationships, that you have people who have concerns or interest in a piece of land that may be hundreds of miles away from the actual piece of land. And so you negotiate with this group of people when in the actual point of fact, there are people who have equal claims to the same piece of land who are a couple hundred miles away. And so from the European point of view, well, we paid for this, we negotiated this, and this is ours. And from the Native American point of view, that's not the case
Right,
at all.
right.
So,
Yeah, there was always a problem of who actually was in charge.
yeah,
I mean,
right.
We had a very firm structure: the President of the United States, the Congress, the this and that.
Right.
But on the other hand, many tribes, there were peace chiefs, there were war chiefs, there were this. Sorting them out and making them in charge, whether they were or not.
right.
When the average Indian man was the ultimate, individualist. If he didn't feel like it was worth being persuaded that it was right, he didn't have to do it. But we just could not wrap our minds around
how
that.
that all worked.
Right. Yeah, that's a European chief, even. That's a European.
chief.
European construct.
Yeah,
Oh,
but
right.
you touched the pen, so to speak, and now you said this. No. I said it for myself, and I'll try and persuade my friends that this is the right way, but don't pin it on me.
Okay, I'm going to change gears a little bit here. There may be many of these, but I think of teaching history in two different ways. One is what I always think of as the great man, I guess these days I should say the great person theory, where you teach history based on the accomplishments of the president or the warlord or the dictator, the person in charge, and so history is a series of stories of the great people, the notables in society, versus another way of approaching history. And these are not incompatible, of course, but there are different focuses, I think, of the common man or the common person way of teaching history, where you try to get into the life and the experience, the lived experience of people in their everyday going about their business. How do y'all see that? Is that a legitimate sort of a dichotomy of the way history is taught in places, or am I sort of overlaying something that's not real?
Oh, it's the bread and butter, pretty much, of
Which
history
is?
at this point. Both of them. I mean, the great man theory's always been around, or the
Right.
person theory, whatever.
Right.
But this bottom up, the bottom up view, has certainly gained a tremendous amount of traction since probably the 1950s. In fact, military history, oddly enough, was one of the places where that began to sort of surface.
Because military history is always this general did this and this general
Yeah.
did that and this general did the other thing.
It's the private that pulls the trigger. And some of the first books that looked at that sort of thing looked at the Minutemen, for instance, a book, on like who were these guys? The famous Minutemen, the guys at Lexington and Concord, that stood and fought and so on. They were militia guys.
Somebody pulled the trigger for the shot heard round the world.
Yeah,
right?
but we're not even
sure
sure
who
who
that
it was.
We don't know. John, you don't know who that was?
Of course not.
You were around then,
It happened,
John.
happened 3 days after I left. So.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, for the first time, scholars started looking at who exactly were these guys, what were their names, and like who were. I mean, what were their occupations, and that began it. And then soon enough, there was actually studies on camp followers of different kinds. Because there were diaries around for that sort of stuff.
Isn't camp follower sort of a
negative term.
Shady.
Yeah.
Yes and no, but I mean, yeah.
I guess it's okay to say on the radio, but it's.
It wasn't in the 7 words that you can't say.
Okay. George
As-
Carlin never used that phrase.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, not that I'm aware of. No.
But the fact of the matter was, camp followers were not, in fact, what we perceived them to be. 18th and 19th century, well, certainly 18th centuries, were loaded with camp, quote, camp followers. These were women, oftentimes the wives of soldiers. In European-style armies, they wound up cooking. They were laundresses. There was a huge infrastructure of people who were not necessarily women of negotiable affections, as they say.
Shall we say?
And that was another thing. Who actually were on the periphery of these kinds of things? The shadow figures that really, in fact, were in many cases, the foundational groups of these particular things.
I think contemporary historians, almost to a person, does both. We talk about the great events, we talk about the big movements, but we talk about the underside and the individuals that were involved that are of lesser note. The biggest problem we have is finding records of those people. They leave very fine footprints, and
Right.
newer techniques, and I think that's when it really changed, was in the 70s and 80s when they began to use statistical techniques, analysis of diaries, analysis of directories, the use of censuses, wills, and all of a sudden there was an interest and an ability to find some information about these groups, and that has been added to, but has not replaced the broader narrative.
Right. So tell me, this is just admitting ignorance on my part, and I shouldn't do this in front of the public, but I'm going to anyway, John. Who did Pliny the Elder write about in history of, the really ancient times? I mean, Herodotus, some of these ancient historians, did they write about, and I should know this, once again I'm embarrassed, the common person, or did they write about the great leaders themselves?
The great leaders and the great events.
Right. That's where that trend, or
That's where you find the information.
right.
Because nobody else could write, probably.
Yeah. And
Yeah, a lot
they
of this
were
was
writing.
oral. It was oral history,
Right.
and so the
So
great
all you
events.
had the brain power to remember was the great
The great
events.
events, sure. They were celebrated things that would be worthy of relating again and again, the Achilles guys and the rest of that, as opposed to Bob the water carrier or, somebody like that. It's hard to get a real, heroic narrative about some of this stuff. And so it fell into sort of a self-defining thing.
Right.
Well, a good example of that, I was a Library of Congress fellow a few years back, and I was doing a piece on the development of the public school system in Dallas, and beginning in the 1860s, and so you had a dual, or actually a black school system, a white school system, and in some cases Hispanic or Mexican American school system, and the big problem for me was finding material on the from the African American point of view. The records simply weren't there. I couldn't find the material that I needed to find to be able to express that voice.
Right.
And so I could find all kinds of things about what white people said about black people in the public school system. I could go, for instance, to the records, city council records. I mean, all kinds of things I could go to, but very little about their voice. You probably had the similar kind of thing with
The Little Egypt Project.
Yeah, the Little Egypt Project.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of the 1860s,
Yeah.
given what's going on in America today with Charlottesville and with the downtown Dallas, I would say that the Civil War, of course, was fought over states' rights and a little bit of tariff protection, right? That was the reason for the Civil War, right?
well, it
That's
depends on.
simplistic.
Yeah.
That's a little sarcasm there, John. A little sarcasm there. Sorry, not making that quite explicit enough that was sarcasm. But we're really refighting a lot of these battles that one would think had been settled long ago, and so we're refighting. In fact, I just was reading a story last night. I looked it up in preparation for being here today. Dallas School District has decided to rename 4 schools. William Cabell, Stonewall Jackson, Albert Sidney Johnson, and Robert E. Lee are going to be renamed. And it's going to cost the district $150,000, which seems to be a reasonable investment.
It's your money, though.
It's my money. That's
Yeah.
right. So, that's a huge controversy. Do your students are they really interested in this currently really big controversy in the country? Is that something they talk about?
I don't see it in the context of the classroom. I try to bring it up,
Right.
as points of discussion. In many ways, as a historian, I'm kind of saddened by this. I don't know what you would call it, but tearing down monuments. I said in the class the other day that if we examined every single leader or everybody that we've raised a monument to, there's always some kind of skeleton in the closet. I was talking about Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln and the Black Hawk's War. If you were a Native American, you wouldn't exactly be excited about raising a monument to Abraham Lincoln because of what they did to in that war to Native Americans.
Right.
And so it reminds me of the Egyptians, for instance. One of the things the Egyptians did anytime there was anything unhappy or if they lost a conflict or whatever, they erased every memory of it.
Right.
so
That's right.
so we got to have a distorted view of ancient Egyptian history because so much of that is lost.
Yeah, and there also people have rushed into a lot of this stuff without really thinking much, and this we went through this some time ago about Indian place names, as is in American Indian place names. And it never got much traction, I might add, because what it boiled down to was by the time you got finished fixing things as in the latest and greatest iteration, at least for a period of time until it was redone, it was a huge amount of work. It largely was, in many cases, impacted a very small aspect of history, and once it was gone, it was gone. And so out of sight is not out of mind, or should not be. The historical record is crucial in its entirety.
Right.
And just taking it and stowing it in a warehouse someplace is not going to be the thing to do. And another thing is this is turning out to be a pretty expensive proposition, and I'm not entirely sure that for what it actually does, we're
It's
getting
the
much
taxpayer money.
Well, it's not. Yeah, what bang for the buck? And I'm not saying that a great deal of it isn't worth doing, but what I am saying is the communists have a great way to do this. They've trucked all of the fallen idols of communism into these sort of parks. And they set them there, and people can go there and look at them, and typically they are somehow or other interpreted.
Yes.
And so they serve as a lesson. And we're not doing that. We're just removing them, and if somebody will take them, like orphans, if somebody will take them and put them someplace, fine. But to have them out, seemingly, I mean, we're literally whitewashing the entire idea, and I just think that this is not the way to do it.
I know that at UT Austin there was a lot of discussion over some statues there, and I think they decided ultimately to take a number of statues and move them into a museum. So they didn't stow them in the basement, but they took them from the place where they were in a park or in a plaza in front of a building, where the idea was that they were not just part of education, but they were in positions of honor, and they didn't deserve to be in positions of honor. So we should take away the implication of honor and move them into a more educational specific surrounding.
It's a slippery slope, though.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'll give you an example that at the end of the Civil War, the honor accorded Robert E. Lee by Union forces. There's a whole different ethic. And to me, I admired that.
Mm-hmm.
To fight such a bitter conflict, and this sense of honor and chivalry going back and forth. We should not forget that.
Right. Sure.
We can remember without adulation.
Yeah.
Correct.
And I think the question is, are we trying to hold these up as people that have done great things and are great men? Or are we trying to hold them up as a participant in a very great event that has long-term implication? And I think as long as we remember why we're remembering them, then it makes sense.
Right. Right.
I don't know that it does much good to just rip things down.
Yeah. I know that there was a suggestion by Joe Strauss that some of the statues in Austin be left in place, but that the plaques on those statues be replaced with language that didn't just say, "This is Robert E. Lee, the great general of the great army of Northern Virginia," or whatever. It's something to sort of actually provide a little bit of historical context. Certainly cost less to replace a plaque than to tear down a statue, but it's tough to know what's the right thing to do. And
But
maybe
even that worries me, because we impose on history,
right.
Rather than actually, like we were talking the other day, being able to listen to people in their own authentic voice,
Mm-hmm.
with all of their warts and whatever it is. Being able at a point, I even asked in my class for students to dispense with judgment, but try to understand things from the perspective of the people who are actually living it. I think that's more valid.
More valuable.
Than to somehow impose because we're offended by.
Right, right.
That I think it's not the way to go.
And I have to say that I tend to be mistrustful of anything that is done in too big a hurry.
Yeah.
Boy, and that is
right.
that is exactly what is happening in many cases. People are being stampeded into things that once they're gone, they're gone.
Right.
That seems to be one of these things where suddenly everybody just goes, well, it's the thing to do. Well, what do you mean it's the thing to do? Well,
Right.
it's the thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Who's right?
And we talked about this in my class today. We were talking about how a bill becomes a law. We're talking about the U.S. Congress, and I was making the point that the process through which a bill passes in order to become a law is long and arcane and difficult on purpose to slow
Right.
it down, to create a space for thinking and revision and amendment and rethinking before the signature goes on to it. So,
Yeah, constitutional amendments are classic examples of
Right,
that. I
right.
mean, it seriously has to pass the smell test, or else. And our Constitution is largely a product of that. Okay, we made a couple of errors there on prohibition and whatnot, but then again, we
Right.
revised that sort of
Sure,
thing. And
sure.
I think that's why it is the way it is.
I think
Go
to
ahead.
be a good historian, you have to suspend your current judgment and try to understand the judgment of the time. And I constantly tell my students, when you're looking at it from this point of view, this was the kind of decision that was made. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It means that based on their worldview, this made sense. And I think what frustrates me is trying to apply a 21st century standard to a 15th century person.
Right.
It doesn't work.
I'm really frustrated right now. I knew this was going to happen. We've only got 15 minutes left, and I'm about 10% of the way through the questions I wanted to ask y'all. I don't even know where to go next. But there are a couple of questions I ask my students. If you had a group of historians in the room, what questions would you ask them? And there were some really good questions that came up. So I'm going to ask a couple of my students' questions. One was, how do you what advice do you have for people who are trying to separate out reality from legend or folklore? The example the student used was Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf and the founding of Rome. Well, I think we can assume that Romulus and Remus, real or not, were not actually raised by a wolf, but there's historical debate over whether Romulus and Remus were historical characters and participated in the founding of Rome. But when you look back all those thousands of years ago, how do you separate out that? And that question really struck me because we're struggling with the same thing today. How do we separate out what's real, what's fake news, from what's reality today? And so it matters to Romulus, Remus, and the wolf, and it matters with us today. So how do historians view that? So that's a broad question.
Well, here's one thing, and that is fake news is not anything new.
Right.
There's if there's a historical lesson in anything, it's that fake news is alive and well and was a long time ago. Who knows? Romulus and Remus may have been fake news at the time. People were like, what do you mean a wolf? A wolf. So there it is. And George Washington is a classic example of, in our own mythology.
Did he not chop that cherry tree down?
No, and he didn't throw $1 across the Potomac.
No.
It's a mile wide there or something. He couldn't have blown it across with a cannon,
But
And
isn't that kind of what we do, though? I'm remembering a quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin, kind of like, we'll leave history to sort it out, and what will history think we were, demigods? But we tend to do that, I think, and we want to do that.
Well, and maybe to a certain extent, it's put there so that historians in the future have to unwind this thing. It keeps us in business.
That's right. I got a job.
Yeah, we got a job. I'm all for that.
I think go back to Romulus and Remus. The more important issue is about the belief patterns. What did people believe back then?
Okay.
I worked in tribal societies where all kinds of things that we couldn't rationalize in our heads. And it was my intent to really try to appreciate and understand, again, how they think, what was important to them. And to get at the undercurrent, or who was it, Noam Chomsky, your philosopher,
Right.
linguist turned philosopher.
Linguist,
right.
Right.
The deep structures, what's underneath
Right.
all of that. I think that's more useful. So going back to ancient history, of course, we're so far removed from it. And we just don't have enough of the pieces. Today, we have a problem where I am so frustrated. You should see me at home.
I can see you right now, Curtis.
Grinding his teeth.
I'm sit at the TV. I've collected a supply of rocks. I bring in sit next to me so I can throw them because there's too much information.
A friend of mine is a professional photographer and has on his wall a photograph of an Elvis Presley TV that Elvis had shot. There's a whole bullet hole in the screen of the TV. So I guess everybody has that problem.
So our
Curtis
it's
and
going to
Elvis.
take time, right, and to sort all this out. And what we see today, the facts, whatever that is. More importantly, I think be left to future generations to really try to understand, like Noam Chomsky, those deep structures, those things which really motivate our society, the undercurrents. And philosophy,
Right. Well, a lot of history is product of your sources.
yeah.
And it's been able to evaluate sources to weigh the real out. We do an oral history project, and one of the things that the students discover is those interviews. They think this person, knows. Well, I've just learned all of this about Vietnam, and then find out the person interviewed someone else. Oh, he didn't have that experience. It wasn't the same for him, and it's putting all that together and giving it some reason and some meaning, and that's why it's always changing.
Yeah.
Right.
Because we either get new sources or we get new analytic techniques and we get new meaning, or we ask different questions. We weren't asking questions, what was the role of a wife 200 years ago, until recently.
Right.
And that's changed a great deal of what we're doing.
And you mentioned the oral history project, and I've got some concerns about that. I've been interviewed repeatedly in your oral history
Me
project.
too.
You're supposed to say no. You're supposed to say no.
Okay, here's my trouble, though. It's not the fact of being interviewed. I'm happy to do it. It's that I'm always worried that I'm going to give this student different answers to those questions than I gave the one last semester.
Who cares?
Welcome to the world of oral history.
I know.
And one of the
That's
things
probably
that-
what they're learning. Mr. Moore said this last semester. He's saying this semester.
Here's the deal about that. We've added another tool, and that is that we've now put in there not only a transcript of questions that the interviewer asks, but also one that they can send the interviewee prior to the interview, just like they do in the real world of, say, 60 Minutes or something like that.
Oh, they're not supposed to do it there. No journalism student here is going to do that.
And the whole idea, well, remember, these are oral histories, and
Right.
Right.
and not interviews in the
Right.
strictest sense. So
Correct.
what we want to do is we want to jog that memory back. And a lot of times, that is exactly what we're looking for, the evolution of memory over time. And does it, as distance increases, does it get more focused in a way, or at the, if you will, in the moment, Is it sharper?
Right.
And so we want to jog the individual's memory, but the important thing is in these oral histories, and this is interesting because we're getting towards Thanksgiving here, time for families to get together. One of the things that should be done, everyone is a historian, and if you're sitting down with your family and you got some old guy, Uncle Bob and whatnot, and you're interested in what he did or what your family was all about, you need to ask right then, because history can be a very volatile thing, and when everybody's gone, it's too late then.
That's a fascinating point because I hadn't thought about that. I have a 9-month-old daughter, and we're going to be going to Austin an upcoming holiday to visit my wife's father and stepmother, and my wife's father has just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and I think that one of the things that I should do is take Lee aside with a recorder, a tape
Yes.
recorder.
Yeah,
Yes.
you need a tape
Yes.
recorder.
And ask him
or
some
digital.
questions, a digital
Yep.
recorder of some
Yep.
sort.
Something
and
your
talk
phone,
about his
yeah.
history, his time when he was flying helicopters in Vietnam, and his time as he was building his career and the things that he did.
Yes.
I
Yeah,
think that's
because-
a good idea.
Yep.
Because that
It'll be
stuff
gone.
is
Right.
it'll be gone, absolutely gone, and then it enters the realm of fantasy, so
Right.
to speak.
But then
Well,
we'll be able to play it for Madeline. 20
Yep.
years from now, she'll
Yeah,
be able to
do
say, "This
that.
is Granddad."
Do that.
exactly. And if that's done a million times, that's a million times better
Right.
than it was.
Right.
And so it's something to think about.
A few years ago, we did a piece with the National Endowment for the Humanities. America's History is My History, and the students had to collect photographs of their relatives, and the idea, of course, was to show the connectedness that they had with their past. And it was amazing what the students came up with. These photographs had a student, her great uncle or whatever it is, was not a great uncle, but a judge in the Nuremberg trials. This person was, and it was amazing to see the connections. We had one Vietnamese student bring in a photograph of a relative in 1880 something who was the guard for the emperor of Vietnam, and all dressed in the garb, and
Right.
just amazing the inner relationship between all the
Right.
that we are not that far removed from history itself.
I've talked about
yeah.
this kind of thing.
Yeah.
My first wife, her one of her uncles was actually on the plane on the Enola Gay.
Oh, wow.
Really?
Yeah.
On the Enola
Yeah,
Gay.
right.
And we went to Washington where he lived, and we talked to him, and he talked about it a little bit, but we never, and I've thought about this 1,000 times since then. I wish I had taken a tape recorder and gotten more from him, because that would be a fascinating bit of history to play for everyone.
Well, here's the crazy thing. My father was with the 509th on
Oh, yeah?
Tinian. He was the air materiel commander, wing commander, with the atomic bomb group. And I never talked to him enough about it.
Yeah.
We talked a lot, but never everything. And now he's gone.
Now he's gone,
And
those stories are gone.
yep.
Yeah.
Okay, we're approaching the end, and I hate that. I want to ask y'all to come back again sometime, but for now we got to let it go. The last thing I always ask every week is, what kinds of things should I have asked y'all about? And maybe even, what is your elevator speech for history? Why should students study history? What will students get out of studying history? I keep hearing that liberal arts degrees these days are useless. Everyone should have a STEM degree or an accountant or skills-based degree, and liberal arts degrees are no good these days. What do y'all say in response to that, or how would y'all like to close today?
History is the ultimate reality show. You can watch them on TV and think, man, that is a cool thing. I can't believe somebody wrote that. I got news for you. History is better than anybody wrote. The best screenplay is still not the best history.
I walk into the classroom and I say to the students, welcome to another episode of As the World Turns.
History orients you to where you're going and where you've been, and there's no knowledge without history.
Right.
History is what is behind it. If we had to reinvent everything each time because we couldn't pass it on through history, we'd be in a constant cycle.
Right.
History gives us the chance to move forward.
Okay. History repeats itself, but not really. That's what the old saying, the old saw is history repeats itself.
Right.
But I'm not sure that's true. Is it true that history
There
repeats
are
itself?
certain circumstances that appear very similar, and sometimes with similar results.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can learn by past mistakes. From World War I to World War II, we learned a lot and made major different approaches to World War II. So
Okay.
we can learn from the past. If we don't learn from the past, we're condemned.
To repeat it, right?
Repeat
Yes,
it.
that's
Yeah.
the other. That's the other old
Yeah,
saw,
that's
right?
the
The
other
other old saw, and it
There's
has
some
a
truth to it.
certain grain of truth.
Certainly.
And if we erase history and it's gone, we won't. It will repeat itself because we won't know we
Right.
did it before.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Solomon says there's no new thing under the sun. And so it's really interesting to me to look at history and the whole idea behind liberal arts. And I see it as a point of empowerment.
Mhm.
And whether you go into the business world, whatever, you have to have a sense of perspective. And history is one part of the liberal arts package that helps to empower people and
Okay.
to give them a sense of perspective.
Well, that's going to have to wrap it up for us today. I certainly appreciate it. This has been More and Friends, and we've had Professors John Trickel, Clive Siegle, and Curtis Thomas here, and it's been a great, interesting hour. I've got a whole additional page or page and a half of questions that I didn't get to, including the one I really wanted to talk about, which was how long is America going to last? But we're going to have to leave that one for another day. That's right.
We're not futurists.
Based on the history, based on past history, how long will we be here? Anyway, thank you all for coming out. Thank you for listening, and we will see you again next week.
Enjoyed it.
All right,
care.
thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys, and thank you for being here. You have been listening to More and Friends on KDUX Web Radio. The views expressed on this show are those of our own and our guests, unless otherwise stated, and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of KDUX Web Radio, Richland College, or the DCCCD.